Hello everyone, how are you? I'm Luciana, this is my YouTube channel 24 horses per second, and today we're going to animate the liquid, make the steam and render this animated 3D scene. Make sure you stick until the end because I'm gonna show you some rendering techniques to save both space and time. I'm going to start with the easiest, which is animating the liquid. For the animation of the liquid, I'm just gonna go to the material of the liquid, and in the mapping node, in the y-axis of the rotation, I'm gonna press I to make a keyframe with a value of 0. Then I chose a random keyframe because I'm gonna set up the speed later, and just move the y-axis until you like the position of the liquid and press I again. I copied the first keyframes and paste them at the frame 301 because if my animation is 300 frames and I paste the same values of the frame 1 to the frame 300, I will have 2 consecutive frames with the same value. At this point my animation was pretty slow, so I just copied the keyframes with less frames between them, and because I wanted some sort of loop, I spaced the frames pretty equally. And I did some speed test making a preview, so I didn't have to render the animation to see if it was too slow or too fast. Even though in this case we are working with Eevee, so the rendering is pretty fast already, but this also works on cycles, so it's pretty useful. So to make a previs or previsualization, first make sure you are in material preview mode. This also works in solid mode, but because in this case we need to be able to see the material because that's where our animation is, we're gonna use this mode. However, this doesn't work in render preview mode. Second, make sure you have an image format such as PNG or JPEG, because if you have AXR for example, the only way of previewing that animation is importing those frames in Blender in the compositor or in other software, which will take longer. Also make sure you don't overwrite nothing important. You could have a folder just for previs or just the temporary folder that is usually by default. And you could even change the resolution to something smaller because, well, it's just a previs anyways. For demonstration purposes, I changed my timeline to only 3 frames, so this doesn't take long. And now go to View, Viewport, Render Animation. And the frames will start rendering, and this will take a while obviously. Then just close this and go to Render, View Animation, and you'll be able to watch your previs. Here nothing is moving because I have only 3 frames. Sometimes it takes a while to show the frames at real speed, and you can even pause the animation with the space bar. And here, if we go to the folder, we have our previous frames. You could even render some previous frames to make a breakdown later and show the final animation versus the previous. Also, you can render a single image if you choose Preview Render Image. And in this case, the previous was rendered in camera view because in the viewport I was in camera view. But if you're not in camera view mode, or maybe you haven't decided your composition yet, you can just make a previs from any angle you want. It renders what is in your viewport basically. So back to our thing, I also decided to animate my x-axis. Now the steam. Now it's just me adjusting the size of the mirror and the size and position of the plane and changing the particle settings, so I'm just gonna show you the final settings in a moment. Now for the material. At first I did the material in the plane, but you should make it in the mirror. Here, depending on how different you want your main color and the second color to be, is the color you're gonna choose. I wanted something really subtle. And these are my final colors for the steam. Changing the size of the mirror in here. My final particle settings. in my first render this came out looking bad, so I'm gonna fix this by sticking the strawberries out a bit. And I'm gonna insert a face. I'm gonna render things separately because that will give us more control in compositing. I can lower or increase the exposure only in one element if I want to. Also, it gives us the possibility of digitally paint each object separately, and this way we'll have files that are lighter in weight. The Steam first. I render all the 359 frames in this case. As you can see, I hid everything except for the lights and the steam, but this was the long way of doing it. I'm gonna show you how to hide everything easier in a minute. What I did was making a new collection. Leave the lights and the camera out of the collection. I renamed the background collection to table, and now this collection with all the objects but the table, let's set it to set hautout, and now render as a single image. We don't need the same table for like 300 frames, that will be a waste of rendering time and space in your computer. Save it. Now let's disable the table from the render, and also let's disable the cap by just dragging it to that disabled collection. Save it. Now let's drag the table to the other collection because it's just one object to move instead of moving the cup or the cake, and disable. And now I'm gonna make sure I only render the frames that I need. Frame number 1 and frame 120 are the same, so that's why I rendered until the frame 119. Choose your folder, make sure you don't overwrite anything, and now just hit render animation. So in the next video, we're gonna take all these images to Photoshop or Photopea, which is an online free alternative, and we're gonna do some paint over to give this anime light style. As always, thanks for watching and see you in the next one. Bye!